The final showdown between Rome and Carthage. Imagine a city so rich that its people decorated their temples with gold and silver. A city so powerful, it once controlled the Mediterranean Sea. Now imagine that same city being burned to the ground, its people taken away as slaves, and its name erased from history books for years. That's the story of the Third Punic War, the final and most brutal conflict between two ancient superpowers, Rome and Carthage. For over a century, Rome and Carthage were fighting on control over trade, land, and power in the Mediterranean. They had already fought two massive wars before. The First Punic War, 264 to 241 BCE, was a fight over who would rule the island of Sicily, and the Second Punic War, 218 to 201 BCE, saw Carthage's famous general Hannibal almost defeat Rome. But even after two wars, these ancient powerhouses couldn't let it go. Rome was paranoid. They believed Carthage was still a threat, even though Carthage had been humiliated after losing the Second Punic War. Rome had forced Carthage to pay a huge fine, give up its navy, and promise never to fight another war without Rome's permission. Still, Carthage managed to bounce back. The city became wealthy again, focusing on trade instead of war. But Rome wasn't happy. They saw Carthage's growing wealth as a sign of danger. But by the end of 149 BC, their deadly game would come to its final, disastrous conclusion. The legacy of Hannibal, a shadow over Rome. Before we dive into the Third Punic War itself, we need to understand the deep-rooted fears that pushed Rome to launch this devastating conflict. These fears were born out of the harrowing experiences of the Second Punic War, fought between 218 and 201 BC. The Second Punic War is famous for one reason: Hannibal Barca. This Carthaginian general, one of the greatest military tacticians in history, became the living embodiment of Rome's deepest fears. Hannibal's invasion of Italy is still considered one of the most remarkable military campaigns in history. In 218 BC, Hannibal led his army, including war elephants, across the Alps into Italy, an unimaginable feat at the time. Over the next few years, Hannibal's forces would strike fear into the hearts of every Roman citizen. His victory at the Battle of Cannae in 216 BC was a crushing blow to the Roman Republic. Out of an army of around 80,000 men, nearly 70,000 Roman soldiers were slaughtered in a single day. This disaster was so devastating that it threatened to unravel the entire Roman Republic. But despite these crushing defeats, the Romans were not defeated. In a remarkable display of resilience, Rome rebuilt its army and, under the leadership of General Scipio Africanus, eventually managed to turn the tide of the war. In 202 BC, Scipio's forces defeated Hannibal at the Battle of Zama, forcing Carthage to surrender. However, even though Carthage lost the Second Punic War, the trauma of Hannibal's invasion was etched deeply into Roman memory. The Romans could never forget how close they came to being defeated by the Carthaginian general. His name became synonymous with fear, and the idea that Carthage could rise again to challenge Rome haunted the Roman psyche for generations. The survival of Carthage, a resurgence that couldn't be ignored. While Rome celebrated its victory in the Second Punic War, Carthage, though battered and broken, survived. The peace treaty that ended the war left Carthage severely weakened. The city was forced to pay a hefty indemnity, reduce its military to a fraction of its former size, and surrender its overseas possessions. Carthage was no longer the dominant naval and trading power it once had been. However, despite these harsh terms, Carthage did not simply disappear into history. The city began to rebuild, and by the late 2nd century BC, it had regained some of its former wealth. Trade flourished once more, and its merchants were once again conducting business across the Mediterranean. But for many Romans, this revival of Carthage was a source of deep concern. The idea that Carthage, despite its earlier defeat, could recover and once again pose a threat to Rome was deeply unsettling. The fear of Carthage's resurgence, particularly among the Roman elite, became one of the driving forces behind the decision to go to war once again. Rome's leaders, haunted by the memory of Hannibal, feared that if left unchecked, Carthage could rebuild its power and challenge Roman supremacy once again. Rome's political elite, including figures such as Cato the Elder, began to push for drastic action. Cato, who had seen the devastation wrought by Hannibal's invasion, became a staunch advocate for the total destruction of Carthage. In every speech he made in the Senate, Cato would famously end with the words, "Carthage must be destroyed." These words echoed throughout Roman political circles, stirring the public's fears and pushing for a final, all-out war. The catalyst, Rome and Numidia. In 150 BC, an event provided the perfect excuse for Rome to act. Carthage found itself at odds with its neighbor, the Kingdom of Numidia, a client kingdom of Rome. The Numidian king, Massinissa, had been encroaching on Carthaginian territory. Carthage, desperate to protect its borders, took military action. This move, though driven by defensive concerns, was seen by the Romans as a violation of the peace treaty that had been signed after the Second Punic War. Rome's reaction was swift and harsh. Rome demanded that Carthage disarm and dismantle its city defenses, impossible demands that left the Carthaginians with little choice but to resist. At this point, the political climate in Rome was strongly anti-Carthaginian. The Senate, influenced by Cato's rhetoric and the fear of Carthage's resurgence, was determined to eliminate the threat once and for all. Rome, in its eyes, had no choice but to act decisively. The war was inevitable. Carthage's resistance and the siege begins. The Carthaginians, knowing that Rome would not back down, made their final stand. The city of Carthage was well fortified, with high walls and a strong defensive position. However, it was not only the walls that the Romans would have to overcome, it was the will of the Carthaginian people to survive. Despite their weakened state, Carthage's leaders and citizens were determined to protect their home from the Roman threat. The Roman army, led by Scipio Aemilianus, was a seasoned and formidable force. It consisted of both Roman soldiers and mercenaries, including troops from Rome's allies, which was crucial for the long and costly siege that lay ahead. Initially, the Romans set up their camp outside the city's strong walls, intending to block any escape and prevent Carthage from receiving supplies or reinforcements. The Carthaginians began to prepare for the worst. They fortified their defenses, mobilized their forces, and attempted to rally their people. The leader of Carthage, Hasdrubal, took command of the defense, knowing that the city's survival depended on his ability to hold off the Roman legions. Hasdrubal, though not as famous as Hannibal, was a skilled commander in his own right. However, despite his best efforts, the Carthaginian forces were no match for the overwhelming power of Rome. In 149 BC, the Romans began their siege of Carthage. As the siege began, the Romans quickly established a blockade around Carthage. They cut off trade routes and intercepted supplies from the rest of North Africa, but this did not immediately bring Carthage to its knees. The Carthaginians proved resourceful and resilient, continuing to fight back. For the Romans, the siege was more than just a military operation. It was a test of endurance and patience. Despite the blockade, Carthage remained steadfast, and the siege continued into the second year, with both sides preparing for a prolonged struggle. The Carthaginian military, though weakened from previous wars, still managed to put up fierce resistance, using their naval fleet and internal defenses to maintain control of key sections of the city. The Carthaginian navy, while not as large as it once had been, still played a significant role in defending their coastlines, even though it was mostly confined to the city's harbor. The Romans, who were not only aiming to starve the city into submission, but also seeking to destroy its power, launched repeated raids on Carthaginian positions. However, Carthage continued to rebuild its defenses and make use of its formidable defenses. After a prolonged period of blockade and skirmishes, the Romans began a full siege of Carthage in 147 BC. The Romans constructed siege walls around the city to trap the defenders inside. This wall effectively isolated Carthage, leaving the defenders with limited options. The Carthaginians tried several times to break through the siege lines, but these attempts were repelled by the Romans. The Romans began building siege towers, battering rams, and other machinery in an attempt to breach Carthage's thick walls. They also constructed a series of trenches to help protect their own soldiers from the Carthaginian attacks. Despite this, Carthage still held out, and the situation became even more dire for the Romans, who suffered both from exhaustion and the harsh conditions surrounding the siege. As the siege wore on, the Romans began to face their own difficulties. Supplies were strained, and some soldiers became disillusioned by the protracted battle. However, the Romans had learned from previous sieges and had mastered the art of maintaining long-term campaigns. They were able to draw upon their allies in Numidia and other parts of North Africa, ensuring that they could maintain a steady supply of food and reinforcements. Carthage was not without its options for defending itself. Despite being heavily besieged, the Carthaginians made repeated efforts to counterattack. They used their remaining warships to launch raids on Roman supply lines, and even attempted to break through the Roman blockade. On a few occasions, the Carthaginians succeeded in damaging Roman forces, particularly in their attempts to fight back at the blockade on land. Despite these efforts, Carthage's resources were being drained faster than they could replenish them. The city's food stores were dwindling, and morale was sinking. The Romans, on the other hand, were increasingly able to cut off vital resources and press the siege even harder. The fall of Carthage, the final assault. By 146 BC, the Romans had gathered enough strength to launch a full assault on the city. The siege had dragged on for years, but the Carthaginians' resolve had not faltered. The city's defenders fought with everything they had, but their efforts were in vain. The Romans, led by Scipio Aemilianus, the grandson of Scipio Africanus, pressed forward with ruthless determination. The final assault on the city was brutal, with house-to-house fighting that turned the streets of Carthage into a battlefield. Carthage, once a proud and powerful empire, was no more. The lasting impact of the Third Punic War. For Rome, the victory in the Third Punic War solidified its position as the dominant power in the Mediterranean. With Carthage destroyed, Rome was free to expand its influence even further. The war also marked the beginning of a new phase of Roman imperialism, as the Republic transitioned toward becoming an empire. For the people of Carthage, the Third Punic War was the final chapter in their city's long and storied history. They had fought with courage, but ultimately, their defeat signaled the end of their empire.